My name is David.
And my name is Jason.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. Our first segment is What Happened Here Recently. Jason, today I want to talk a little bit about secrets at the table and how that's kind of played out differently in some games that I've been playing recently.
Okay, sure, go for it.
So when I'm talking about secrets, I'm talking about table knowledge of the players versus the character's knowledge that they're playing. So recently, I had one thing happen with some purple lotus powder. That wonderful little magic item that can give really good abilities or really bad abilities or really neutral kind of abilities, but they're completely random. It's from
Death Frost Doom.
Yeah,
right?
from Death Frost Doom. I pretty much just always have that as a pretty standard thing that occurs in my dungeons just because I think it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
But I had one thing happen from it that was something I was supposed to not tell the player about themselves, where they were able to, whatever they said, they would be believed for the next three things they said, but they were expressly not supposed to know that about themselves. So I went with it and I didn't tell them. And I kind of wonder, was it more satisfying that they didn't know, or would it have been more fun if I had let them know that, hey, the next three things you say are going to be believed, no matter what?
Huh. Okay. Yeah, it's a tricky question, right? I mean, so you said you ended up going with not telling the player.
Right. So I didn't tell them until after they had used it all up. And then I was like, that's why I kept saying, and they believed you when you said that statement. Well,
how did it go? Did it have any purchase? I mean, it sounds like it could be something that might just be wasted if you didn't know it was going to happen.
Right. And in fact, it was just completely wasted, but they had a good laugh whenever I told them, that's why I kept saying that statement to them over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah, I see.
And they believed you. But it just kind of made me think, I don't know, are secrets like that worth keeping, or is it better if I had let him know? I don't know. What do you think?
I almost always err on the side of letting the players have knowledge that the characters don't have, especially if I think it will give the players the tools they need to actually make a good scene.
Sure.
And that's where I'm inclined to land on questions like that. It's okay to have secrets at the table between the GM and the players. There are certain things that, for purposes of dramatic tension or maybe some kind of plot twist or reveal, you want to keep, you want to keep behind the GM screen, so to speak, right? You want to keep some of that information behind from the players. But for the most part, I like to talk pretty openly with the players about kind of what's going on, as a sort of meta conversation about what's going on in the story, so that the players have a chance to think about cool scenes that might happen, right? Now, maybe I'm just lucky and I have players who play in the proper spirit, which is that they don't use that information to their character's benefit necessarily, right? They still play their characters as if their characters don't know. As a general matter, I have a big issue with secrets at the table. I don't like secrets between players. I've played in games older, D&D style, more traditional games, where player A and player B have some secret thing going on, and the GM doesn't even know. Player C and the GM have something going on, and the players don't know. And I just find that to be really, I find it distasteful. I don't think it's really playing in a collaborative spirit. It feels a little selfish. I think there's some games that are mechanically meant to have secrets in the game, and their mechanics account for that, and that's a different thing. I think that's okay, but as a general matter, I'm not into it.
Yeah, I had another situation like that where my players were all talking about what their characters did and didn't know about each other, and I was like, it seemed really complicated and something I wasn't super interested in. I was like, why do you care that he doesn't know that about you? Why can't we all just be a party in good faith and know these things about each other?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I always err on the side of more information. You have a circumstance. You often have a circumstance where one character has learned something that the other characters don't know about, right? I'm over here on this other part of the dungeon doing Discern Realities, and I learned some things. if the stuff they learned, it doesn't have any like high dramatic stakes, like there's nothing like super interesting about it in terms of like, dramatic tension or anything like that, I just assume the other characters know. Like I just assume that like in the moments we don't see the characters speaking to each other, like the off-screen moments, they would be telling each other these important things, right? And so at my tables, especially after a session or two with a new group, like that becomes sort of like a standard thing. Like you just assume that everyone has the knowledge, right? That at some point your character shared it. But there are going to be times when your character does learn something that they wouldn't necessarily tell the other characters. And I think it's okay to say, hey, I don't think my character would share that with the group, but that's something that all the players know, right? Like the other players know that character knows something that their characters don't know. And I just think it leads to better play. I really do. I think it leads to better play because the other players I think they just can more realistically like play their character when they kind of know what sort of story the other guy's going for.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I did have one circumstance where I almost decided to have some secrets going on, but I decided not to. But I'm really like, I keep thinking back on it, and it's that moment where you might actually like physically separate your players. Like, have you ever done that?
No, I've never done that. I've never done it. I know lots of GMs who do that, and I've never done it because it's just not my play style. It's just not.
Yeah, I've never done it or been involved in a game where it happened. But I almost did it this past week, where one character kind of got into the boss room by accident, and no one else was there yet.
Right. Yeah.
And it would have been really interesting thinking back on how that situation played out if the other characters and the other players had like been physically separated from each other and then come into the room when their character came into the room later on.
Yeah, I think it's okay to try things like that. I mean, experiment, right? I mean, but my analogy is always film and TV, right? And in a way, we're kind of like the director and writers of a TV show or a movie, and the director and writers of a TV show or a movie would not keep secrets from each other. So.
Right. Oh, that's all I really wanted to say about it. It's interesting to think about.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And there will be people who would disagree, right? Maybe not Dungeon World players, but there are going to be a lot of like D&D and Pathfinder players who they're really committed to this idea of like secrets, like passing notes to the GM and passing notes to other players. And, the first chance I get a note to the GM, I'm going to steal all their stuff. I'm not into that kind of play. I'm just not.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next segment. Our next segment is What Should I Be on the Lookout For?
A few weeks ago, we talked about this idea of our core playbooks and like the playbooks, the playbooks we use as our sort of core set, think fighter, wizard, cleric, that kind of thing. And I've been thinking about adding to my core set with this playbook called the Collector. This is a playbook that was brought to my attention a few years ago, actually, by our friends Kristen and Scott. They use it in their Dungeon World game. I believe it comes from Inverse World, which was a supplement published by Jacob Randolph and Brandon Schmeltz a few years ago. I have not played Inverse World, and so I don't know how this playbook fits into the context of Inverse World so much. This playbook, The Collector, it's really neat. There are a few versions of it out there on the internet, but they kind of share like a lot of similarities. I think that they're different evolutions of the same playbook. What I like about it, this character has like a collection of stuff. All right, he has a themed collection of curios, and he can dip into that collection of curios to find things that might be helpful to the situation. He can have a very special curio that's kind of like unique and the only one of its kind, which has different abilities and stuff attached to it. And when you're making the character, you kind of you pick a thing that allows you to choose like whether the collection is organic in nature or mechanical in nature or magical in nature, and you give the collection a theme like flowers or small dinosaurs or whatever, right? And that's basically it. It's just a character that like has this collection of like stuff. It reminds me a little bit of like the Tinker concept that you talked about a long time ago, right? This idea of this character who's just like loaded for bear with all kinds of random shit, except not totally random. Like it's a themed collection as far as the stuff goes. I kind of like that. I don't know why I'm thinking about it. I've never used it in a game. I don't know how it goes. I always like playbooks and moves and things that create or pose a creative challenge to everybody at the table. Like, how do we use this thing, right? We've got this thing. How do we use it to do something,
okay.
Right? Think about the winning move from the contest last week, right? How do we use this random information, or this random thing given to us from the Upside Down Masters, right?
Right.
That's what I mean. That's what I have in mind. And this is a character that's really, really focused around that kind of thinking, and it appeals to me. I'd like to get to the table and see how it goes.
Right. So we're on Discern Realities. We have kind of a philosophy about adding in playbooks. I got to ask the obvious, like, why wouldn't we just strip this down and make it a compendium class? It seems like anyone could be a collector of things.
It's a good question. I don't have an answer for it. It's a good question. I don't have an answer for it. I may do that. I might decide that, like a lot of playbooks out there in the world, the playbook as a whole does not add much. Like there's a lot of superfluous moves. But I need to try it first. I want to try it out first and see how it goes. This is a playbook that made it into a published product, and I'm making an assumption that it got play tested a little bit, right?
Yeah, I've looked at it, and it's definitely an interesting playbook. I still don't know that I completely understand why that's the identity. The collector is what they are most doing.
Right, yeah, as opposed to like a wizard that collects things or a fighter that collects things. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky question, right? It may well be. I might find that I prefer it as a compendium class, but I'd like to try it out though. I'd like to see Chris, and mostly just because Kristen and Scott use it in their games and they really love it. They think it's like really great. So
yeah, I've heard them talk about it, and it makes me excited about trying it out sometime.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll try and get it on the table too.
Yeah, so listeners, it's in the Inverse World book. If you want to, I think that can be purchased on drive-thru.
Great. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next segment. Our next segment is What Here Is Not What It Appears to Be.
I've been thinking a lot about 1v1 play, meaning one GM and one player, kind of like we do on the AP, right? I've been thinking a lot about it because our friend Rich Rogers, who's a host on one of the other shows, or two of the other shows actually, he does a lot of like 1 versus 1 play, like where he and his friend, like one's the GM, another one's a player, not just Dungeon World, they do all kinds of games, and they play in this mode a lot of times in play by post. I've never really done it, and so I'm curious to get your thoughts, and I thought we might just kind of hash it out a little bit. What are the trade-offs or the compromises you make when you decide to play 1v1? How does it affect the types of story you can tell? And if you wanted to try to do a dungeon with one player, like how could you make that work, right? That's kind of the premise of this conversation, I think. So, David, with that in mind, like I would ask you, you as a player, you've gotten to experience a little bit of it, right, through our comic strip
right.
AP. What are the trade-offs? Like, how is it different than playing normal Dungeon World?
So, probably the biggest difference is like it's always me. It's always action to me. It's never, I'm never trying to like push for one of the other players to do something cool or play off of one of them. I'm never trying to collaborate with them. If I'm in a bad situation, there's never anyone to bail me out of it. That's probably
right, yeah.
One of the toughest parts is because, so often you get that 6-, and as a GM, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put that player on the spot, Oh, they've got a knife to their throat. Somebody else needs to save them. You can't do that when it's just one GM and one player in Dungeon World anyways.
Yeah.
Some of the things that I like about it, it really stretches me as a player to try and be on my best and bring my A game because I'm having to do everything.
You're having to carry 50% of the story, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like now that I've done this AP for a little while, whenever I am a player and I've got other players with me, like I can be a much better, stronger player and push for them better.
Oh, so it's almost like you're saying an advantage of 1v1 play is you just get more practice, right?
You get more practice.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's like it's like stronger practice than playing with other people.
Right. Yeah, where you might have a fifth of the screen time, if that. Right.
Right. The kinds of stories you can tell are a lot different.
They're going to be different, right? Yeah, they're going to be different. I've discovered that in our APs. Like, there's just certain things I don't feel comfortable doing, right? Because you don't have a cleric to heal you and a fighter to, take point on the monster, right?
Right. I think a lot of that stems from the fact that Dungeon World wasn't designed expressly to be played that way.
It's meant to be a party-based dungeon crawl, right?
Right. You could make a super character that has like multi-class abilities out the wazoo, so he's able to do all these things, and you might call that character class like the adventurer or something like that, the lone wolf adventurer.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sure somebody's done that before, or created, some kinds of playbooks that are designed to be played solo,
Like sort of like Swiss Army Man type playbooks, right?
right? Or hyper competent that maybe come with some more equipment out the box.
Oh, just straight up statted more powerfully.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, and with some extra, starting gear. So it's like, oh, if I get in a pinch, I've at least got this starting gear that I can fall back on.
I've been thinking about 1v1 play as an opportunity to tell different kinds of stories in Dungeon World. When I run Dungeon World, I run it kind of in one mode. It's an adventure. I run it as a big adventure. There's almost always a dungeon, or there's an approach to a dungeon. There's a dungeon, and then there's some aftermath, right? That's kind of how I know how to run Dungeon World. It's how I like to run Dungeon World. But 1v1 play, I feel like maybe opens up some possibilities, and we've kind of touched on some of these possibilities in the AP of telling different kinds of stories, like more intimate stories, maybe more mystery-based stories, more horror. I think you can get more of a horror element with just one player than you can with a lot of people at the table.
Absolutely.
With a lot of, if you don't have a lot of competent characters like around to handle things, you can really, really ramp up the horror and the tension of the situation. I think there's something to be said about that. I feel like Dungeon World handles it okay. That's the part that's a mystery to me still. Like if I were going to try to run, say, a face-to-face 3-hour session, just myself and another player, would Dungeon World support, for that prolonged session, would it support this more intimate, more mystery-focused, more horror-focused game? I don't know.
I think that it definitely could, but a face-to-face session, it might be just too hard. Like you have to carry a lot of that load yourself. And instead of it being a collaborative experience, it's still a collaborative experience, but your GM prep probably needs to be a lot heavier than normal. Yeah,
I think it probably does. You would necessarily have to prep more because you don't have as many like brains at the table to to like tap for things. I'm very good personally. I've honed this skill over many sessions of Dungeon World. I'm very good at like teasing out ideas from the players and then making it seem like it was an organic part of the process,
Right.
That's a skill I've honed. I would not be able to rely on that so much. It was just
it'd be much tougher. Like you could go back and forth with your one player several times to get ideas out there and then start piecing them together.
Yeah, you'd have to hold on to them for a while though, before you could roll them out there.
Which is probably why Rich does so much of this as a play-by-post, because that's a perfect opportunity.
Yeah,
to step back and think about it longer.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Now, here's something I have done. I've played games with just 2 players before. I've had that group wanted to do like a dungeon. They wanted to get in there and do a dungeon. But, 2 players, 2 characters, they're kind of missing some features of the adventuring party, right? There is a certain degree of like, well, you have to have at least somebody who can fight, and you have to have at least somebody who's good at either disarming traps or finding things, right? So one thing I did with that group was I kind of just stacked them up with hirelings. I gave them like just a crew of hirelings that kind of helped augment their players, their characters' abilities. And I wonder if you could do that with one player. Like, could you have like one player with like 4 hirelings and have that be the party?
So then it would be the player and he's 20% and the GM is 80%.
Well, the player would still be responsible for describing all the behavior of the hirelings, right? Like they'd still be responsible for making those scenes happen and describing the moves and incorporating what the hirelings are doing. It would just be, but he would have the hirelings stats to help with his rolls and stuff, Now in the downtime, in the RP part of it, yeah, it would just be like the GM, but that would be the case no matter what, right? Like it would be the GM talking for everybody else and then the player talking for himself. So,
right. I don't know. You could pull that off. It'd be interesting to try. Like, I'd be interested in trying that at some point.
I'd be curious if listeners, if you've done this, like if you've done 1v1, especially like actually face to face. That's what I'm curious about. Like face to face, one player, one GM. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and move on to our next segment. Our next segment is what here is useful or valuable to me.
Mules, mules, mules. I've got mules. So I've got all the mules.
Tell me about all the mules.
Okay, so I've got two things. I've got a little in media res trick that I love to start a brand new group with. And then I've got a magical item, a mule-based magical item, okay? So, and the magical item actually originally flowed from this little in media res trick, so they're kind of connected as well, apart from the fact that they're both about mules. All right, so my mule thing that I do this in about one every 5 or so brand new Dungeon World groups that I do. I do this thing in the very beginning where the party is on their way somewhere. They've stopped to make camp or whatever, right? They're packing their shit up. And I ask one player, preferably a brand new player, like a player who's never played Dungeon World before. I start asking them questions about their pet mule. Now, they probably didn't even know they had a pet mule, but they do now. And I go on at some length about it. Like, what's the mule's name? Have you had this mule since you were a child? What's that all about? Like, tell me your favorite memory of Clarabelle, or whatever the hell the mule's name is, right? What do you do when she's nervous? Like, how do you calm her down? I just go through these questions, and I love it because a lot of times the other players are kind of like, what the fuck is he doing, right? Like, what the fuck is this even about, right? Like, why is the GM like fetishizing over this mule, right? Like, why the fuck is this important, right? And then the in media res is a monster that bursts out of the ground or bursts out of the foliage or something and grabs that fucking mule, and it's getting ready to like rip its throat open. And and so then I ask that player, what do you do? And that usually triggers a roll of some sort. And if they succeed, they save the mule. If they fail, they do not save the mule. And I describe the mule's neck or whatever getting ripped off or ripped open and blood spattering all over the player and into their mouth, right? And I do that, and I make sure it's really, really like, I like to do noises. I make sure it's real gross and noisy, like, and but I love it because it telegraphs to the players that I like to do this question and answer style of play, and that they should prepare themselves for that. And it also kind of shows how Dungeon World works, right? If you get a 10 plus, you absolutely get to save the mule's life. If you get a 6 minus, you absolutely do not get to save the mule's life, right? Your listeners, you can steal it. Go for it. Your players will love it. The magical item that I want to share today is called the Irresistible Mule. And this is a co-creation of myself and Daniel Fowler, who won the contest last week, actually. Years ago, we created this. And it came from him losing his mule in this little process that I've just described, right? So, but he went one step further. He made it a whole story thing, right? This is what good players do, right? He made it a whole, like, part of his character's story. And so he's like, well, you know what? His character was an illusionist named Zeno. He's like, I want to make like a magic item that like honors Muriel. That was the mule's name, Muriel. And I did the final text on it, but this is the item. The Irresistible Mule. An invention by the famed illusionist Zeno, the Irresistible Mule at first appears to be a simple bridle. However, after handling the bridle for a time, an illusory mule will appear, seemingly attached to it. This mule is luscious with fat and appears to be hauling sacks bursting with coin, kegs of ale, and all manner of cured meats. The mule is positively irresistible to any who might be drawn by such things. As a curious side effect, the mule believes it is real, and will insist on being fed and brushed. It is rather odd to watch it pretend to eat oats, which simply fall to the ground as you place them in its illusory mouth. Failure to treat the mule as anything but real causes the illusion to dissipate, making the bridle useless for a few months, at which point the mule can be coaxed back to return. That's it. We had a lot of fun with that. It's a really fun item.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to the next segment. Our next segment is What is About to Happen.
This is our comic strip AP featuring the adventures of Lucero Castafiel. And when we last saw Lucero, he had just had his eye gouged out remotely by an orc priest, an orc one-eye priest, and his voodoo doll-esque orc on a chain. You are screaming in pain, presumably, because your eyes exploded, Lucero. The other orc, the pincushion orc, so to speak, the voodoo doll orc, he's screaming as well. He's screaming, but his screams have a certain... It's pain mixed with religious ecstasy at the same time, right? I don't know if I can do that well on mic, so I won't try, but just imagine it that way. Pain mixed with ecstasy, as his eye also is oozing out of the socket. But you're screaming in pain. What do you do?
How far away are they now?
Maybe like 20 paces. I should mention that I'm giving you a -1 ongoing until you get this like patched up and treated somehow. So
okay, gotcha. I'm advancing on them, holding one hand over my eye and swinging my chained weapon with the other.
So this weapon, your signature weapon,
yeah,
it's cool. It looks really cool on screen, and it's a neat, unique sort of weapon. Is there a history there? Like, tell me about your greatest fight or conquest using this weapon. Like when did you really like say, oh yeah, this is my gear, this is my weapon?
So this weapon is Castafiel through and through. This is passed down like from generation to generation. This is rumored to be the like demon smiting weapon of an ancient Castafiel.
Okay.
The Castafiels maintain an armory of such items. They have all kinds of lore around them. Who knows if it's true? Who knows how much of it's rumor? But this one is supposedly forged of silver and steel. The chain is, and there are red gems on either end where the weapons are, and those are supposedly filled with the blood of demons and angels.
Nice.
But who could say that? Who could say if it's true or not? In any case, when I was 13, they brought me to this armory, and they would take a weapon down and hand it to me, and then they would point to this dummy, and I would attack the dummy and see if I had any kind of natural aptitude with anything. And, we tried out a sword, and I was okay with that. And then we tried out, a spear. That clearly wasn't the right thing. And then we got to a whip, and I was actually doing really well with that, wrapping it around the limbs and the neck of the dummy. And then we pulled out this weapon, and it was like a well-tailored glove on a hand. This was nice. This was the weapon.
Does it have a name?
We call it Bloodless, the Sinister Shackle.
Ah, nice. Okay. Well, you are. You've got eye goo coming out of your socket. It hurts like hell. You're rushing forward toward these two orcs. The orc with the eye patch. As you get close to him, he pulls out what appears to be a razor, and he falls down to one knee next to this chained up, screaming naked orc, and he's basically going to use the razor to hamstring that orc, thereby hamstringing you. What do?
I'm going to try and whip my weapon out to bind him.
Like to catch him to stop his arm? Or
right, yeah, like whip the chain around him so that he can't do that.
Do defy danger dexterity.
2.
With one, I guess it is a fell swipe, he draws that razor across the naked orc's calf, and the moment the razor touches his calf, you feel, at first you don't feel anything. You initially feel just like the wetness behind your leggings, right, and your boot. But then you feel the pain and you collapse and you fall down. You're hamstrung, your eye bleeding out, in terrible pain. Your weapon just it went a little wide, and it didn't quite hit its mark. Probably because you're missing an eye. That had something to do with it. You're now pretty prone and in a fair amount of danger. The orc One Eye casually walks over to you. he looks down at you. You can see his features a little bit. It's dark. It was late in the day, and there's just some very dim ambient light. But you can see beneath his black hood, he's got very, very filthy, yellowed, sharpened teeth. It looks like one of his bat ears looks like it's been chewed off, decades ago by some foul creature, or maybe another orc that got hungry, right? And of course he has an eye patch on. He's missing an eye. And he kneels down, and he puts his hand on your cheek, and he just smiles. And as he smiles, just like nasty black fluids dribble out of his mouth. And I think we'll end it right there.
That just leaves one final question. Who's really in control here?
That would be the Gauntlet. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. On that website, you can find links to all of our other podcasts, as well as our G+ community page, which you should definitely go join. We also have links to our various meetups, including Gauntlet Hangouts, where we run numerous games, including Dungeon World. And our Twitter is @GauntletRPG.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jason.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, listeners. That's our show.